Right. So, hello, people joining us on the recording. We have Dr. Julie R. Williamson giving us a talk today. It's going to be about VR for public and social settings. There's a bio in Quercus, so you can take a peek at that. But just really briefly, she's a lecturer in human-computer interaction at the University of Glasgow. Okay, I've introduced you twice. Please take us away, Julie.
Yeah, so thank you for that. And yeah, I'm super excited to be talking about kind of VR in social and public settings today. I am one of these early adopters, and I completely believe that, in the future, we're looking at a possible future where people are going to be constantly engaging with immersive technology, the same way that your mobile phone now is kind of your personal device that you take around with you in the world. In the future, I think that is going to transform into like an immersive device. So something that actually gives you the power to like control your reality and kind of change the way you experience the world around you. I mean, and so this is huge. This is kind of changing the nature of human experience. So it's a really exciting field to be working in, but of course there's lots of kind of interesting challenges, not only technical challenges, creative challenges, social challenges, and ethical challenges too. So it's kind of an interesting place to be in. And so I'm going to talk about a couple of the different projects that we've been working on in this space, and also just some of the interesting kind of challenges that I've been focusing on as well. So yeah, I mean, I kind of give a little bit of my kind of background. Why am I a person who cares about immersive tech and kind of social settings? As we talked about in a bit before we started, I'm originally from Southern California. I did my undergrad at University of California, Irvine, in informatics, which is a really kind of interesting degree program. If people, I don't know how your program is structured in Toronto, but this is quite an interesting setup of computing science and design and kind of sociology. So it's really kind of sets you up to be someone who not only has like technical expertise, but also has an interest in the social challenges and how like technology fits into society. So I think there's a lot of flexibility in degree programs that have this kind of multidisciplinary approach for sure. After that, I moved to Glasgow and did my PhD there with Stephen Brewster. And there, my kind of focus was, again, on kind of social acceptance of new and unusual technologies. And so I focused then on gesture-based interaction, but I also have done a lot of work on spherical displays, which is quite fun, crazy hardware. We also will focus on levitating particle displays. So this is a slightly crazy project that's very much in the early kind of stages, but we use ultrasound transducers to levitate small particles and create kind of shape-changing displays. So basically any place where there's unusual displays that might kind of become part of our daily lives, I'm there kind of thinking, how do we actually interact with these displays? What does this mean for like multi-display, multi-user environments? And how does this kind of change the way that we interact together? So VR is a kind of natural progression there, and especially something that I think is interesting because I do firmly believe that that's going to be something that integrates, into our daily lives. This is one of the examples that I really like. A couple of years ago, we ran a workshop in Glasgow looking at, VR for public and social settings. And certainly this is a device called Oculus Go. It's a pretty basic VR headset. But, technically, this works completely great. We had these like bar stools, so you could like rotate your body really nicely. It doesn't require any specific lighting or tracking or anything. So like technically, this works. Socially, this does not work. You can't sit in a bar with your friends and, all three of you, be sitting there engaging with VR. We certainly attracted a lot of attention, and it was all over kind of almost like a breaching experiment. We're kind of pushing the limits of what society would allow us to do. So I want to think, well, how could this scenario, what would need to change in terms of our social kind of structures, the actual hardware, the form factor, the interactions, the types of content? There's kind of so many angles that we could address this problem from. And I hope that we're moving towards a future where something like this could be more realistic. Certainly for now, it's not on the near horizon. But I do think that room scale VR has a kind of place. Room scale VR, untethered VR, all sorts of different kind of things. So, I mean, one example that you might think about and that I've worked in a lot is kind of room scale VR that's in kind of festival settings or kind of social settings that are not just walking around in public spaces. I mean, this was an event that was at the Edinburgh Festival on Princes Street, which is kind of the major kind of right through the city center where the festival occurs. And so they had these huge domes set up, and it's, you know, a place where you could go and enjoy immersive content. So it's not exactly, you know, fully integrated into the moments of our everyday lives, but, you know, we could go somewhere social and go experience immersive content together. And this was the virtual reality studio, as they called it. And then this was quite a fun, quite a silly installation where basically you have 10 minutes alone in the Oval Office, and it's a destructible environment. So you could just tear the place apart. So kind of a good catharsis for people. But, you know, so this is the kind of thing where we're trying to figure out, you know, how can we have something that's VR and, you know, have an interesting interaction that gets people to crawl around the space and do different things. So in the Oval Office, you could kind of crawl under the desk and, you know, find comedy items and, you know, go through drawers and rummage through things. And that kind of trying to get people to really use immersive content in a public setting. But one of the other more recent kind of projects, again, this is like a festival setting, is something where kind of VR and live performance can actually come together. So these the next images are actually from a collaboration between myself, Glasgow School of Art, and National Theatre Scotland, where we wanted to see in a kind of theatre experience, how could we incorporate immersive elements with built sets, maybe a bit of choreography, some live performance, and, you know, create that immersive experience. So in this case, this was inspired by the works of John Berger, who's a kind of author on various experiential topics. And basically, you kind of walk into the space and you're greeted by a steward who hands you a black or a white marble. Once you've done that, you kind of go into the actual area where this is built out, and there's a row of seats that you can kind of see on the left here. So you sit there, you hear a bit of live performance from the guy who's kind of standing here in the black shirt, did a bit of a monologue, a bit of live performance. There was also a kind of soundscape that would be playing. And you're sitting there looking at these two kind of cubes, a white cube and a black cube. And these represent kind of two rooms where you can go and enjoy immersive content. And again, we used Oculus Go for this. It is really nice and flexible and easier to kind of use. It's untethered. But what we were focusing on here was the kind of transition spaces between full reality and full virtuality. I think you guys have read Yard Nib's paper, which I really like. That's actually kind of some of the inspiration for this work that we did around kind of what is that jarring experience when you exit reality or exit virtual reality and come back to reality. So we were trying to really ease that transition, try to make it feel a little bit more continuous, because right now it's very, there's kind of abrupt boundaries, and those don't really feel very nice. So one of my colleagues, one of the things that he says is, you know, what's the first thing that you should see when you go into the holodeck? It should be the holodeck. You should see the grid. You should see that this is a virtual space. You shouldn't, you know, you need to have these kind of transition spaces before you go into full immersive content or full reality. So in this case, when we had these two rooms, we were trying to smooth that transition a little bit. So you go in, you walk into the white cube, you sit down in a chair, you go into VR, and the first thing you see is that room exactly recreated. So you're sitting in the white cube, you're facing the wall, the same as you are in this physical environment. But once that kind of continuity is established, then the virtual environment kind of starts behaving in ways that the physical environment couldn't. So some of the walls kind of disappear, and kind of some quite surreal animations kind of come up out of the floor and through the walls, and different things kind of come and go through the space in the virtual environment. But once that segment is complete, the virtual environment kind of reconfigures itself back into that white cube, and you're kind of asked to exit VR. And again, when you leave, you're presented with that same kind of physical view that you just left in the virtual. So we were trying to make that transition a little bit more smooth, feel a little bit more continuous, but obviously that's a little bit limited by using a VR headset, something that is there is a kind of hard boundary between real and physical content, physical and virtual content. Some of the other projects that we've looked at, again, using kind of Gear VR, but trying to, again, ease those transitions between fully virtual and fully physical. One of the things that we've looked at is actually VR for passenger travel, passenger experiences. So that's what the project, the Viajero project, it's a Spanish word, so that's why it's pronounced in a kind of unpredictable way. But the Viajero project is all about travel and passenger experiences with immersive tech. And one of the first things that we looked at was airplane travel. Airplane travel actually works really well for this as a kind of early adoption scenario for a couple of reasons. Firstly, definitely in an airplane, we actually have quite a restricted place where you can move. You're not walking around and kind of really exploring the space very much. So that actually fits quite well with a lot of the constraints that we have with untethered headsets. Certainly, a few years ago when we did this work, we didn't have inside out kind of camera tracking either. So it fits the kind of constraints of the hardware, which is important. One of the things I often think about is how do we match kind of the hardware constraints and the constraints of the physical setting, and also kind of human capability. And so airplanes were a nice place for this. It's also a place where, you have time to kill, engaging with entertainment or other kind of activities to escape from the kind of fact that you're hurtling through the air in a tin can. This is something that's already kind of accepted. And so we were hoping that as an application area, this is also, there's a lot of demand for escape and for engaging with illusions in a setting that's kind of unpleasant. So airplanes are kind of a nice starting point where people might engage with illusions, might engage with VR. But to design something specifically for airplanes, we had a few kind of constraints that we really wanted to think about. What I've often seen is that VR applications are designed to kind of like maximize immersion, maximize intensity, maximize realism. But actually, most of the time when we're engaging with illusions, we probably want to maintain some peripheral awareness of the world around us. We're not quite at the point yet where we want to like abandon reality fully. So how do you actually balance like immersion and feeling kind of in a private space while also maintaining your kind of physical boundaries and maintaining what's going on around you? There's also the kind of constraint, especially with the airplane environment, of input in a constrained space. So a lot of the games you might see for VR, one of my favorites, like Beat Saber or something, you're not going to be like flailing your arms around in an airplane, not if you don't want to attract a lot of really unwanted attention. So how do we actually, design a little bit more for constrained spaces? But also one of the kind of specific things was about how do you support interruption? Interruption can be really challenging in immersive applications for a couple of reasons. I mean, you don't want to break your presence if you don't want to leave the virtual content, but also it can be unclear to know how do you actually interrupt someone who's in VR? Do you shout at them? Do you wave your hands? Do you kind of tap them on the shoulder? If anyone here uses VR regularly, you'll also know that kind of being touched by someone when you're in VR is very shocking and uncomfortable, and especially if you didn't realize someone was nearby to you. So kind of how do you maintain that kind of awareness of your body and kind of your space and allow for interruption in this kind of setting? So in the Plain VR application, we started out with a bit of a survey to kind of identify some of the kind of constraints and some of the design directions and some of the existing attitudes towards VR for air travel. And we designed a kind of prototype to try to exemplify some of those outputs and test, like, do these actually work? Do these make any difference? So we actually had 4 features that we implemented, and I'm going to forget the exact names from the paper. I hope I call them the right thing, because you guys have all just read this, I think. So we had the mirror. So you can see these 2 mirrors here. When you're not looking at them, they are just mirrors in the virtual environment. But when you gaze at them, which is something that requires basically almost no movement, you just turn your head a little bit. When you gaze at one, it gives you the forward-facing camera view. So you can kind of just take a look outside of virtual reality. if that, let's say you see something there that you're like, oh, I probably need to attend to this right now, then you could push a button and give the full camera view. So in this case, the kind of idea behind these two things is this idea of how do you smooth that transition, or maybe kind of create a space between full virtual and full physical content. Going in and out of the headset is it's an opportunity cost. So if you can kind of reduce the number of times you need to do that little peek, that can actually be a really nice way to maintain the headset, but also know what's going on around you. So we had those two kind of user-initiated approaches, the kind of peek through the mirror and the peek through the forward-facing camera. There are also then two kind of externally implemented interruption techniques. So we had a controller for Gear VR, and in one case you can just get a kind of notification, someone's trying to get your attention, and then you would be able to figure out, do I want to stop? Should I look and see who's there? Whatever. And then the second one was then a notification that would flick immediately to the full camera view. So someone basically that's the equivalent of snapping in your face to get your attention. It removes all the virtual content and puts whoever's trying to get your attention in your visual view. So we wanted to evaluate these and kind of see, how does that work? Did this help to make VR kind of feel more acceptable in an airplane and kind of increase the user acceptance for this? So it brought up a few really interesting things. And certainly we did find that the kind of lightweight ways of checking kind of out of virtual reality through the mirror, through the peek, and also through the full interruption with the forward-facing camera really did help. And people felt like that gave them that middle space between full virtual and full physical. And so that's something that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about since I did that work. And trying to think about what does it look like when that continuum of virtuality is something that I can move along continuously. So how do we actually design for more continuous transitions between physical and virtual? So here's kind of an example of this is a kind of mock-up of something that I'm thinking of, but imagine you're walking down the street and I can be anywhere between, fully virtual, maybe seeing a few virtual things like these signs that are in the virtual space, or I could fully flick back to kind of full reality. Those interactions, I think that's kind of an area that I've been exploring a lot in my work lately and trying to make this a more continuous space. One of the other things that came up in plain VR is, how do we design for near possible futures? This is a kind of open challenge that I think a lot of people that are thinking about new technologies, most of us in HCI, how do we design for a context that maybe doesn't exist yet? And so I really like this, like is a strange word. I mean, this picture always gives me a lot of thoughts around VR. And, if this is a kind of near future that we might be hurtling towards, how can we actually design for this, either to prevent this, hopefully, or, design for a place where if in a near future, everyone is wearing a headset, what is that going to look like? And how do we design for that? And there's a few really nice papers kind of there around speculative methods, but I think this is an open challenge and one that I think anyone who has interesting ideas, for the future needs to think about. In the case of the plain VR paper, we did these focus groups with an experienced prototype, but that's kind of one of many ways of doing this. So this is still an open question. I don't have very many answers on this one. So one of the kind of inspirations that came from this, from plain VR and having this kind of getting something closer to mixed reality interactions, we were thinking about reality aware headsets. And so what would that mean if a headset was kind of helping you engage with reality as much as it helped you engage with virtual content? And so one of the ways we've been thinking about this is, a reality aware headset is one that is capable of identifying, so there's some sensing, interpreting, so there's some processing, and responding, so there's actually some output to kind of the reality that's around you. The picture that I've got here is actually the Nreal headset, which is an interesting kind of new-ish AR device. And we're kind of interested to see, how would it work when we have more and more kind of sensors facing out into the environment. There's a lot of interesting questions around this as well, of thinking back to devices like Google Glass and how uncomfortable people are with kind of cameras that are body-worn cameras, filming you constantly. If you're using a VR headset like Oculus Quest, for example, or this, you can see the cameras at the front of this Nreal device. These cameras are, in theory, kind of recording everything, measuring things about the environment, capturing people's likenesses, their face. Understanding how this kind of works in an ethical or social sense is another open, kind of interesting question. So we've been thinking about this, starting off a little bit more from an interaction standpoint, but the ethical issues are there as well and are quite broad. So we kind of thought about a few ways we could structure what ways kind of devices could be reality aware. So the kind of current, thinking about your basic Oculus Quest, for example, which has very limited, or Oculus Go, which has very limited sensing of the outside world. It could ignore reality. And that's certainly something like Oculus Go ignores reality. And I think that was one of the things I talked a lot about at that point, of the fact that it had no outward facing cameras. You can tell that device is probably not going to last for very long. And of course, Oculus have now kind of sunsetted the Go, which is probably for the best. So it could ignore reality. It could do things like just observe reality. So thinking just in terms of sensing. So the system kind of observes and identifies elements of reality, but maybe doesn't do anything necessarily with that information yet. So something like the Quest, with its forward-facing cameras, 4 cameras on each corner, is constantly measuring the environment, doing some processing there. But you can certainly use it with the defaults. It won't do much with that information except track your place in 3D. One of the kind of next steps, though, could be, for example, communicating some information to the user. So, for example, with Quest, when the nanny boundary comes up, the guardian, actually, I think that's the right term for it, when the guardian pops up, that's something that's communicating to you something about your physical environment. So if you're walking out of the play area, you're about to run into a wall or something, it's giving you a kind of grid that's showing you where the boundaries are. So it's kind of communicating something about your environment. And that's kind of where most, I think, of the headsets are right now. But the next kind of a more interesting stage would be like, could the headset actually kind of react more proactively in a way about something that it's identified about your reality? So things like Quest, I'm not really sure do much of that yet, but one of my favorite VR games, which is for HTC Vive, what is it called? I've suddenly forgotten it. Unseen Diplomacy. I don't know if anyone's played it, but it's really cool. It's a game that uses like redirected walking. So if you've got your play area that's, 4 by 4 meters or something, I think it requires, the virtual environment actually constantly adjusts itself so that even though you feel like you're walking through this like large compound in the game, you're actually kind of going in circles in your space. So it's actually reacting to where your walls are. And so, in the game, it might be something like you're walking through the building and the hallway bends. In your environment, it just kind of seems like, okay, this is the shape of the building, but it's bending because your wall is there. And so the game has a bunch of different aspects. You have to crawl through vents, and like the elevators, when the doors open, the rooms will be orientated in different ways depending on how your space is shaped. And so this is something that's actually reacting to reality in a way that's completely seamless in the virtual environment to the user. So this is kind of, I think, the best of reality aware. That's more of in software, but headsets could be doing similar things as well. So there's all these different kind of ways that headsets could increase their awareness of reality and communicate that to the user, and also change things automatically for the user. And one of the arguments that I would make is that, this is absolutely necessary for these headsets to kind of become more integrated in everyday life. Until they're really doing this in a way that works well and feels good, they're not going to have that widespread adoption that I'm hoping and waiting for. So when we think about some of the things that we studied, we studied a few kind of basic notification styles in that reality aware headsets paper. And again, some of those same themes are kind of coming up again and again around kind of disruption and when do you interrupt and what information do you provide as part of that interruption. And so there's a lot of really nice work on kind of notifications in VR and interruption in VR. But I think we're definitely, there's so many open challenges there because it's a theme that comes up again and again. And I don't think we've really found all the solutions yet. For anyone who uses, headsets regularly, then you'll know that the kind of interruption and notification stuff that's in products is still as well pretty underdeveloped. One of the other kind of interesting issues that came up here was around kind of control and responsiveness. So this is one that I think it's like a bigger challenge than just, am I in control of my headset? The example that we kind of talked about in the paper was, if the headset automatically changes the volume level so you can hear things happening, outside. This is a really small way that the headset might kind of control your experience. But headsets, as this becomes more sophisticated and kind of becomes more complex, this sense of control over one's own reality could actually become quite a tension between kind of users and headsets. And one of the examples that I really like there is, if I'm walking around in my daily life and experiencing things with the headset, do I feel in control of my reality, or is the headset in control of my reality? And so understanding what manipulations that headset is doing kind of seamlessly as part of my experience is an open ethical challenge for immersive technologies. Definitely something that's that's up for debate. And kind of some of the other issues that we're kind of thinking about more generally, the kind of future of mixed reality, again, go along this kind of ethical lines of what does it mean when I'm kind of changing the way that I'm experiencing reality. And the example that I really like that one of my colleagues has kind of said before, Albrecht Schmidt, if anyone knows him, and he's kind of said, if we're both walking down the street and we're wearing our immersive headsets, what does it mean if we're experiencing something materially different from each other? What does this mean for the fact that, well, we both walk down the same street and experience something very different? So this is an important question for the future of kind of mixed reality and how reality is incorporated into our experiences. We've already seen, how intense the kind of different experiences of reality can be with things like social media bubbles. Imagine if that's not just a social media bubble, that's actually what I see when I walk around outside. So the kind of future of mixed reality has a lot of interesting problems and interesting ethical challenges as well. The last bit that I wanted to talk about is a little bit different from some of the other things, but is still kind of fun and a bit interesting. So one of the other virtual environments that we've been thinking about since lockdown, rather than all being together in a festival or out having a meal or in a public space enjoying immersive technology, the other kind of side of that is we might all be distributed around the world enjoying immersive technology. So it's a little bit of a different problem, but one that still has a lot of interesting challenges as well. So what we had done actually is last year, in the wake of canceled conferences, we actually tried to hold some of these events in Mozilla Hubs. And Mozilla Hubs is a kind of interesting platform. It's an open source platform from Mozilla, which means that you can customize and do all sorts of interesting things to it. But also it kind of works in a standard browser. So it is a little bit limited as far as virtual environments go. It doesn't look as nice as VR chat or something, but it works on a mobile device. It works on a standard computer, and it also works in Oculus Quest or Rift and some of the higher end headsets as well. So we wanted to see a little bit, do these environments, work in these ways? Can we use some of the same social kind of theories to understand how people behave in virtual environments? One of the kind of big influences for me has been kind of urban theory and urban sociology. So I'm a big fan of things like William White, who studied, how people move through public plazas, how the presence of, trees, benches, food stands, street performers, all sorts of interesting things that happen in cities. How does it actually change the way people move through public spaces? And so we were thinking, can we use those same techniques that were used by kind of urban sociologists to study virtual environments as well? There's been a lot of interesting work doing that in a qualitative way, but as computing scientists, we were also interested, could we combine qualitative work with quantitative work? So in this case, in our custom instance of Mozilla Hubs, we instrumented the environment with tracking. So we have everyone's kind of position, orientation, and a few other kind of things about, what platform they're on and when they're speaking and different things like that. And try to understand a little bit around how people move through virtual environments and could we understand something about their interaction. So this is some of the kind of just silly pictures from the event that we did. But this is kind of the beginning point of that interesting stuff. So this is the kind of bird's eye view of how it looked during the event. And this is regenerated based on the data. So this is kind of, in my mind, this is some of the most kind of fine-grained data that we can get from a virtual environment. And most of the things that we would use, things like VR chat, which I love, or like Oculus Rooms, or, any of these other Gather Town, any of these other virtual environments, you can't track people in this way. Things like Second Life have the same problem. You don't have access to the tracking, right? So if we have Mozilla Hubs, we actually have full access to the tracking and can log it and use the data in this way. So in this case, this then gave us a lot of interesting insights into things like how far apart do people stand in a virtual environment? And what's interesting is that it actually mirrors almost exactly how people behave in physical environments. So people do, keep that arm's distance away from all the other people in there, even though, of course, you're a virtual, body, you don't need personal space. But people still maintain those same social boundaries. And so we did a bunch of quantitative analysis of how people behaved in this virtual environment. And it's kind of the beginning of that thread of work. We'll be presenting this at CHI 21. But if anybody's interested, our Mozilla Hubs tracking code, the full data set, and all of the Jupyter notebooks that generated these visualizations are actually available on GitHub. So we're trying to see if people are interested in doing more Hubs stuff. But yeah, I think that's the kind of closing remarks. So just to kind of summarize a little bit, what is the kind of point of all this? Some of this is quite playful and quite exploratory, but there is actually, as I say, I'm trying to work towards that vision where I do think we will have immersive technology kind of with us all the time in the future. And so what I've been focusing on is kind of what does it mean if we have always on immersive devices? On the left, you see something like this is Magic Leap. And of course, I'm not going to wear that all the time. I look like a crazy person. It's probably definitely not socially acceptable to walk around wearing something like that. But actually, you might be surprised to hear that the image on the right, that is also an immersive device. It's audio only, but this is Bose frames. And besides being that jerk who walks around at night with sunglasses on, this looks totally normal. And so those kind of devices, the form factors are getting there. The Nreal glasses, which I had a picture of in the slide before, again, look pretty similar. They look like normal glasses. So we're getting to a place where the form factor is ready for always on, but we're definitely not there in terms of interaction techniques, social acceptance, understanding how bystanders or spectators feel about these devices. So there's kind of some interesting problems in that always on space. The kind of other big open challenge is, what does it mean when, reality and virtuality are seamless? What does that mean to blend that content And also, what does it mean when we can no longer differentiate between kind of virtual stimuli and physical ones? There's a lot of really interesting technical problems there. You know, how do we actually process and composite these kind of visual images, and also then the kind of ethical challenges. You know, if we can't differentiate virtual from physical content, what does that mean for what's real? So there's a lot of interesting kind of higher kind of ethical challenges there as well. And so I'm really interested in, these days, and also the kind of ethics, kind of responsible immersion, and how do we ensure that technology, that this immersive technology has a kind of positive impact on society, and is not, you know, like that kind of famous Facebook image of, you know, Mark, you know, walking in front of the hordes of people like trapped in reality and virtual reality. So how do we ensure that kind of immersion is something that augments our lives rather than kind of isolates and divides us? Yeah, so that's the end. Thank you for having me, and yeah, happy to have some like questions, discussions, anything. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That was awesome. Gotta say, felt like you knocked that right out of the park. That term that you had there at the end, uh, responsible immersion. Nice. I never thought about that before, but that is certainly on point and very much related, of course, to the general topic of like the theme of this week, which was about, you know, how do we think about VR as it's embedded in real environments, essentially. So, man, awesome. I'm gonna let students, if you've got a question, maybe you can raise your hand if you'd like to ask Julie directly, or you can post it in the chat. Um, I have a couple of my own, but I'll save those if I see questions. So I do see a question right now. This is from Rohail. Rohail asks, did consumer level Google Glass fail because it didn't take the real use of AR into account, or was it more of a test than anything else in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, the thing, if I had to pinpoint kind of one or a few reasons why Google Glass failed, is there is a very poor mental model from the kind of bystanders what those cameras do and what they capture. You know, and that's not to say that, you know, people that didn't understand Google Glass, you know, they don't get it or they're stupid. I mean, it's definitely on us to kind of build things that allow people to have a mental model of what's going on. And so while I think it was kind of an interesting example, you know, it was never going to really succeed either, because I think the utility wasn't really there either. So yeah, I mean, I think really thinking about the social constraints and why people reject technology, and people definitely rejected Google Glass. It's going to be interesting because something like, you know, an Oculus Quest, if anyone hasn't seen them, like, you know, 4 cameras along the front, and they're quite small. And so if people don't, you know, necessarily, maybe people might not recognize those as cameras, and so they don't get upset that people are filming them. That's just as bad as people misunderstanding that there's cameras there and that they are filming them or whatever, you know. So creating something that actually is transparent to bystanders, is easy to understand, is easy to kind of make a judgment, make an informed judgment about. That's really on us as kind of HCI researchers. Yeah, so I don't know if that answers the question, but
I have a follow up to that. It was one of the things that came out of the plain VR stuff, the paper that we saw, and very much related to this question was, I mean, in that work, the emphasis I think was on the experience inside the VR headset. But I think one of the comments in the paper was like, man, it'd be really weird if like this guy, like this person was just watching me and I was like outside of it and I didn't know. And so that I think resonates with your comment right now. And I just wonder, how do we think about, you know, how can we think about showing, you know, like people on the outside what is happening in my virtual world, sort of, and what thinking have you done there?
yeah, I mean, that's something where, because we have this situation where only a few people have the tech, the people that are outside really can't see in. There isn't a way for them to see in right now. But actually, some work that I really like, which I don't think it's published yet because he uses it in teaching, but like one of my colleagues at NYU has basically set up some interesting infrastructure for, you can be in a headset and be exploring some virtual content, but actually there's an AR view using a mobile phone. So if I'm like, what is that person looking at? They can just, the other students can pull their phone up and look and see what they're seeing. And for me, like that's something that it's that kind of first step of like, if I'm outside and I don't have a VR headset, like I can still look in and see what those people are looking at. And I think that's some of the stuff that we need. Like until every single person has a VR headset and can engage with the same virtual content, we do need that kind of ways for spectators to see what other people are seeing, and how we make the kind of trust and kind of infrastructure security wise for that. That's a totally different thing, but
And
I
how
do. I
creepy
love.
would it be if I'm like, wonder what he's looking at, and it's like, oh, it's me.
Yeah, yeah, but like that could be a way that it's done. I mean, we need to have a type of content where everyone who's present can engage with it. It's we've kind of developed those social norms with phones. It's but we don't have that social contract yet with VR headsets, and so few people
Yeah.
have them. So
It reminds me a little bit of like I think of this as being sort of kind of like for me the parallel is the early days of cell phones, right, or handhelds. And I remember at some point, like I could have sworn somebody was trying to introduce legislation, I can't remember where the idea was like if it's taking a picture, it needs to make a really loud picture taking sound. Essentially, I don't know if it stuck or not because my phone can take pictures very quietly, so maybe it wasn't in Canada or whatever. But it did make me think, like, a lot of these practices have sort of emerged, just as you said, kind of just because so many people have it and stuff like that. So then the question is, does this space need sort of like an Apple that introduced the iPhone, made it so that everybody wanted one of these things, and then practices will sort of emerge like that. I guess that's more of a comment than a question. So maybe I'll phrase it as a question, which is to say, can we shape the direction of that through work like the stuff that you're doing?
yeah. I mean, I don't know. Maybe this is again more of a kind of comment, but I mean, I would really, really like to see kind of user-led, kind of grassroots, kind of you know social contracts developed by people. I personally think if we let the corporations do it, we're going to have that evil Facebook scenario, not immersive tech augments our capabilities as humans. That's the future I'd like to see, but I definitely think like HCI is really uniquely placed, I think, to do this, because we're really engaging at all levels of the stack. So some people are working down at like signal processing and like really cutting edge kind of not product devices, but we're also on the very other end where it's like, no, we're looking at like markets and the actual products that people are using. So like HCI researchers, we're looking at the full stack.
Mm-hmm.
So I would really like to see kind of some leadership in terms of, like what are the social contracts that make this technology a positive force. And I think people need to do that, because I don't think we can trust companies to do it.
Right. Okay. I see Rohel's responded about the mandatory shutter. So the mandatory shutter sound is law in some countries, as far as I know, because of creepy people taking creepy pics. I don't see other questions, so I'm going to ask my next question. You were talking, and this brings us back to kind of the first set of things that you were showing us, kind of when they were going into the white and black boxes. And you had kind of a moment. It was actually sort of a throwaway comment, I thought, but it sort of made me think a lot more. You talked about the holodeck. This is from Star Trek Next Generation for all of you kids out there, and for me, I actually thought about it as a transition space, but mostly for TV. I thought like, oh, I'm watching TV. They need to explain to me sort of what's happening, which is like this grid box, and then they press a button and poof, kind of like things kind of come to be in that sort of holodeck. And it also made me think about surreal things that you see in TVs or movies, like when somebody's getting high or something like this, and like things happen. And I guess my question is, can we use movies and TV as a design resource, as a set of ideas then? And are is it limiting in some and or is it limiting in some ways?
Yeah, I mean, science fiction, they've always been, much better futurists than than, most of the technology-driven people. I mean, we're often thinking kind of in terms of like, well, what can the tech do? Like, what are the capabilities of this system? As where, science fiction writers, they're thinking more of like, well, what should it do? What could be possible? And I think you definitely need a little bit of both. There's a kind of space for like design fictions where the sky's the limit and you design what would be the best thing possible, but also like we need to have some steps to that take us there. It can't just be completely unrealistic. And so I mean, I definitely think that there's like space for that. I mean, one of the things that I love and I've been watching a lot of lately, actually, again, is like Black Mirror. Some of those dystopian visions are like actually not that far away from like what our tech can do right now. And so I think it's definitely it can be inspiration for, um, you know, for leading kind of the technology towards something that we're trying to evaluate. But yeah, I mean it's interesting about the holodeck. That some of that is a storytelling narrative, for the audience. But those same rules of like, can I follow what's happening? That's the same rules for like my experience in my life, right? Like in my own life, I need to be able to tell like, okay, what's happening now? Why are things changing? What does this mean? So actually like narrative and those same techniques totally apply to interaction design.
Thank you. We have a question from Michael Yaroslavsky. This question is, do you think VR can be dangerous in the future? I think a lot of how VR can be dangerous, especially because of how immersive it is. Employers and companies can abuse it to get people to stay in VR for a long time. So I think there might be a parallel to social media there, or the
Yeah.
platform that we use on our phone.
Yeah, I think for all the great things that VR could do for us, I mean, it could do equally horrible things. And actually, we did a workshop at Kai in 2020, basically on kind of like dystopian visions and abuses of VR. And so you could imagine all sorts of kind of terrible ways that VR could be used. And one of the examples that one of my colleagues kind of likes to bring up is, VR, for example, could be used to kind of desensitize people to violence so that in the real world, they aren't afraid of committing violent acts. Like this is a pretty realistic, we could do that right now in VR. Immersive technology is used to help people overcome phobias. Why not overcome phobias of things that we want people to not do and to be afraid of, in public spaces? So there's definitely a lot of scope for like abuse in VR. Some of those things like that, like, desensitizing someone to violence, that's maybe something that seems quite realistic in the right now. But I mean, once we get to that point where VR content is indistinguishable from real content, I mean, this could be used to covert, the human senses. You can imagine all sorts of ways that this could be used for evil, whatever you want to call it. So it's that's why I think it's important that that we think about these issues now and kind of build that accountability into VR.
Certainly, that's where that phrase of yours, responsible immersion, comes in, right? Yeah, I like that. I have one last question, since I'm not seeing any others from the students. I'm just thinking about your own work, right? So when you are designing things and you're prototyping things, like, to what extent do we need to create full working prototypes to explore these ideas? Do you use storyboarding in your work? Do you sketch, essentially? Do things need to work like for real, or can we kind of approximate and learn from those?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely use the full range of prototypes. I mean, some of which are like a picture or a sketch. You definitely do not need to create this like fully functioning, beautiful prototype to figure out whether it's good or not. And actually, I would argue that we probably shouldn't be doing that. One of the things that I kind of thought about a lot during my PhD was, like, well, I could spend, 2 years making a gesture recognizer that's great and works perfectly. But what if those gestures are not the ones people are willing to perform, able to perform, can perform consistently? It's making something that works is really the kind of last step. But before you even start thinking about prototyping a physical thing that's going to work and be great, there's so many other ways to evaluate the concepts and to evaluate user attitudes, to actually take a bit more of a divergent approach. So like working with like paper prototypes, with sketches, with storyboards. One of the things I use a lot are videos. So even with kind of VR headsets and immersive tech, we'll create basically a design fiction of like, well, this is what it would look like, and this is what you would experience. If you do something like that, you can actually maybe explore, 20 or 30 concepts instead of one. So it's most of the stuff that we're doing, especially with VR, when the kind of tech is straggling a little bit behind kind of our aspirations for input techniques and visual fidelity. Using other techniques is actually pushing the field a lot more than making one prototype that works great, because it's I always find a bit more value in being a bit more divergent.
Because you can be expansive about your thinking rather than being constrained by what you might be able to do with the tool today.
Yeah.
I lied. Can I keep you for one more question, if it's okay? Yeah. Abigail has a question. When designing VR for public spaces, how can users be eased into the experience to avoid barriers like perceived social embarrassment?
Oh man, this is a really good question. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, one of the things that we've thought a lot about, especially in the things like where we have like festival deployments, is kind of like, what does that mean when someone has their first experience with VR? And I mean, that can be really something that kind of make or breaks someone's ideas. I mean, think about people who, if you had used speech recognition when it first came out and it didn't work and it was awful, a lot of people were like, well, speech recognition, that doesn't work for me. As we're now, I'm thinking probably like 10 or 15 years on from the first kind of speech interfaces. Now, you don't really think twice about it. And so VR is that same way. I think we don't want to turn people off to it by giving an initial experience that's quite bad. And most of the time, the experiences that you create that are bad, it's actually, it's a total flip from my previous point, but it's actually often because of bad development. So creating something that doesn't run at a high enough frame rate, or creating something that otherwise is a kind of poor user experience. If there's kind of one thing that's really common in kind of badly designed VR is like there's maybe ambiguous cues or bad cues. For example, thinking about depth cues. If you put things that are ambiguous there or actually don't quite fit with how depth cues are supposed to look, this is a bad experience, and someone's going to say, oh, well, VR is not for me, it just doesn't work. And so creating some kind of simple experiences that are really kind of accessible and easy for people to use. So things like at festivals, we've done a lot of those kind of things. One of the other things I did with a few colleagues in Swansea actually is we built an enclosure for a VR headset that's designed to be installed in a public space, so it can just stay there unstewarded. And it was a really simple application. It was a kind of historical copperworks site, but all the buildings are gone, and it's kind of a sad post-industrial site. We made a virtual environment that shows what the buildings looked like and what used to be there, and people can put their head in this thing that's on the site. That was for a short time, but it was on the site there, and see kind of what the place looked like. So that's another way where like it could be someone's first experience with immersive content, this thing that they've stumbled across in this kind of park in Swansea. And so I think, creating those initial experiences and getting people to kind of get a feel for like what VR is, that's how you kind of get people in the door. But the second one, of course, this is a kind of classic why people adopt technology, is if there's a clear utility, there's an actual reason why people use it. Google Glass, I'm not sure what the utility of that was, even though I love all of these types of devices. And so we still have to think about like, what's that kind of point where the utility of VR is going to overcome the social kind of barriers. And we're definitely not there yet. But, thinking about other devices, like what was the point where you thought, no, I can't leave my house without my phone? Like, when did that point happen? And so with immersive tech, I think we'll get there as well. But we need to design those applications that add value to people's lives.